Hello, class. Glad to have you here again. I just appreciate so much all of your input that you're giving to me in class. It's really been encouraging to me. Some of the things that you're getting out of that. I know we've already talked about, the formation of a mission and how this thing even got started. And some of you have even talked about some of the things that you've already seen just from what you've learned. And then in the second one, when we talked about the formation of the training, some of you were talking about even in boot camps out in Fout Springs, how rugged it really was and how basic. And it really did, in essence, prepare them for people, or prepare people for what it was at that time and for living in jungle conditions. And then the one we did today, of course, was the one about the formation of our strategy, about how we go about doing our work, where we're going in. We have our end goal in mind first, where we talk about the mature church, and that's what we call it, a mature church model. And in that mature church model, people, we know what the end goal is, and then we can work backwards from there and talk about what it is we need to see happen, what non-negotiable things have to happen in order for that church to come to maturity. Today we're going to be talking about, on this particular one, the podcast I'm doing on the weekend, happens to be the formation of our unity. What is it that makes us work together and tie together so well? And that's what I want to talk about, because this is really something that you may or may not have heard about, but there are just some really interesting things. It isn't like we're not trying to say this is what you need to go through or what others have gone through, but or what you will go through. But these are some of the things that started off our mission, and they were hard trials, but they did draw us together and bring us together. So in talking about the formation of our unity, I want to talk once again, remember those three core men. There was Cecil Dye, Paul Fleming, and Bob Williams. And those three were very focused on reaching unreached people groups wherever they were at. And remember that at the time, when you talk about an unreached people group, that was almost anywhere. They weren't very technologically advanced at that time. Transportation had not been very well developed, other than because of the war, World War II. Technology, electronics had not happened, so we weren't having radios and telephones and all these different things. All those things were brand new ideas. Just even the idea of a radio was new. There wasn't any television at this time. So all of these things, ways of communicating, were non-existent at that particular time. So they had to figure out, how are people going to survive out there in the middle of jungles? Well, Cecil Dye and Paul Fleming and Bob Williams all knew their time, and they couldn't see the future and what was going to happen, and they didn't need to. But they did deal with what they were trying to accomplish at that particular time, and do it the best way that they could. As time has gone on and as things have progressed, technology has become better, the transportation has become better, communications has become better, and all of that. So that has really helped advance some aspects of our work. But there are certain aspects that don't advance. They just are normal biblical things that have to happen no matter what age you're in. So we have those three guys, Cecil Dye, Paul Fleming, and Bob Williams, and they joined together and formed this organization. Then they started developing a training program with some other men, like Lance Latham and Bill Dillon, and how to prepare people spiritually, getting them ready, and then also getting them ready technically, or if you want to call it technically, how to live out in the jungle, how to learn a language, and so on and so forth. So finally the day comes and where they're sending their first missionaries, and 5 of those guys went. 2 of them were Cecil Dye, one of the founders of the mission, and his brother Bob Dye. And then there were some other men, Dave Bacon, and a couple other guys, and they went down to try and find a group of people in Bolivia called the Ayure. And when they went down there, they thought, okay, we're going to try to do this the best we can. We're not going to try and take chances. So they did little things. They'd hike out or they'd cut their way out into a jungle, sometimes only able to cut a quarter mile to a mile a day, cutting through the jungle because it was so dense and thick, and through thorns and whatever. And then they would leave gifts or leave a pole with things on it, and then hopefully to make some contact with some of the native folks that were there, and try and establish really simple contacts to begin with. And Of course, any kind of language learning that they were going to be doing was what we call a monolingual approach. They didn't know the language, the people didn't know English, and so there would be it would take a long time. But anyway, that's what they did. They tried to give that. Well, as a result of that, and they went in, and as things happen, something happened that we certainly weren't looking for, but it did happen, and we hated to see it happen. But the first 5 missionaries that ever went in died. They were killed by the native folk that were there. But there was a lot going on behind the scenes. It wasn't the missionaries that were causing them problems, but there were always animosities between the native folks, the tribal folks, and the government and farmers and so on, because the people would come out and take food that they saw on the ground, which was actually the farmers' food, and the farmers said, that's our property, that's our stuff, we have to grow that to live. And so that's what happened. They tried to They would take that. And so there was this animosity going on between those people. Well, our guys walked in. They were white guys also, and when they went into there, they were trying to be friendly, but some of the people didn't trust them, and as a result, there was a situation coming up where some people, some of the native folks, there had been some things happen with them and some of the traders and people, and some of these traders would come in and try and take advantage of the women, and our guys were just caught up in something that they really had no control over, and as a result, they were killed. They were clubbed to death by the Ayure natives. So that was an interesting thing that really happened. It was a difficult thing, and I know it was they really hated to see that happen, but that was one of the costs that they were willing to pay and willing to work out if they had to. They weren't really trying to go in there and get killed. They didn't think that was the most effective way of doing it, but that is what happened. So as a result of this, right before they went in and they were killed, they sent a letter out to the people that were out there at the base, kind of sending them off and waiting for them to come back and resupply and hear news and so on. And the letter said something like this, and it was a covenant kind of that they put to themselves. It was kind of a call for all-out volunteers. And here's what they said. I don't believe we care so much whether this expedition is a failure so far as our lives are concerned. But we want God to get the most possible glory from everything that happens. And we know that the powers of hell are marshaled against anything that would bring about this desired aim. On the other hand, it seems that it would be a real testimony to the Lord's power to make this expedition successful. Then again, perhaps more Christians would become more aware of their responsibility to lost men and less concerned over the material things of this life if the expedition failed and we lost our lives. Maybe they would pray more for the next group that went out to the same tribe, and maybe there would be more all-out volunteers so that every tribe would be reached in our generation. I believe the real attitude of every fellow in this group is that they want, at any cost, that which will glorify God the most. Cecil Dye, co-founder of New Tribes Mission. So that's what they were looking for. They were looking for to leave a testimony, but at the same time, they wanted people to be challenged. And so they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't want to die. They wanted to reach those people. That's what they wanted. But as a result, they did die. And so that's one of those things that happened. And as a result of that, I'm sure they had a lot of pressure to fold up and said, look, this is God's proof that he doesn't want you in there. He's not letting you live. But they looked at that as a challenge to continue on and do the work. And as a result, many others were challenged when they heard that these guys were willing to give their lives to reach these people, then they could do the same. They could take their place. And by the way, these 5 guys are not the same 5 as Jim Elliot and all them. That was 13 years later, I believe. And so this was 13 years before that. And there are other things that were there too. And the reasons why it wasn't as well known, probably because in 1942, a war was going on. So most of the news was wrapped up in things that were happening around the world in our war. So some missionaries that get killed in the jungles of Bolivia is probably not a big news item at that particular time. That's okay. The Lord knew that. And so there were other things that were going on. And but anyway, so 5 guys died. Now, then in 1951, which is 9 years later, another guy went into the jungle by the name of Dave Yarwood, and he was going on in there to find people. And when he went in, he was actually with some other guys, and they had to go into town, and he was out there. So he says, no, listen, I'll stay here and kind of keep talking with these guys to keep the information going and learn what I can. You guys go into town and then come back, and then I'll be waiting for you. Well, while those guys went into town, some of these natives did the same thing to him. They killed him. Only this time they shot him through with arrows. And the reason that they did that, we found out later on, was because somebody from a timber company who had heard, either timber company or a mining company, I can't remember which, who had heard that these missionaries were in there and probably making it a little bit safer. They came in and they decided to kind of sexually treat one or molest one of the girls in the village, and the villagers got mad, and they treated Dave as one of that guy that did that, and so he was killed. It's an unfortunate thing, but that's, they went in for the right reason, and he can stand before the Lord knowing full well that he did what the Lord wanted him to do. Then there were 5 more missionaries. Now this is really interesting. I did not know about these 5 until just a few months ago, and it's interesting. The first 5 guys went into these ayores, and then we got permission, and we went in later on. The wives of these guys that were killed, some of them went in with some other people, and they actually reached these people, and they became believers and so on. And guess what? 5 of their guys decided they wanted to go reach some of the other villages. And so their first 5 missionaries, their Ayore missionaries, they went into the jungle to reach some other ones. And you know what? The same thing happened to them. They died also. So it wasn't because we were white that they were killed. It was because there was a lack of trust, or they didn't know the motives for what was going on. But that was it. That was just the seed of the church. The interesting thing is, in 2017, we just had our 75th anniversary. And you know what's really interesting about it? It's the 75th anniversary last year, the 75th anniversary of the Ayore Church. So for 75 years, those people have continued on, and the church has matured and done a good job. That's pretty amazing to have a church that lasts you 75 years out in the middle of a jungle without missionaries in there. So that's done pretty good. So those 5 died also. Then in Fout Springs, which is where we had one of our training centers, it was our first real training center in the sense of a boot camp where they went to go and serve and try and learn and live like in the rough conditions and so on. In 1946, they had these 2 big dormitories, and in one dormitory was where they had all the dining hall and some of the other stuff, and the other one was where they had marrieds that would sleep in there, and their the kids and everything. And so the marrieds would come over and they'd all eat together and everything. Just, it was a big communal thing. And while they were sitting there eating, one of the parents had left their child back in the cabin sleeping in the crib, and there was an electrical fire. And before they knew it, somebody come running in yelling, "There's a fire in the cabin, in the dorm." And the dorm, they tried to get it out, but they couldn't. And the dorm burned up, and the dental specs lost their little daughter. And so I just think about one of my kids or grandkids, if that had been mine. But see, they lost. And so we had those 5 guys at the beginning, the 5 Ayore missionaries, Dave Yarwood, and now we have little Ruth, who was, she passed away as a result of that fire, and I'm sure it was very, very tough on the dental specs. But you know what they didn't do? The dental specs didn't have to suffer that alone. They had friends there, and it tied them together and pulled them together. It pulled them together as a group of people who were committed to serve Jesus Christ. And then in 1953, we had another situation. As part of the training there, our men, which this, like I said before, this camp is what they call the civilian conservation camp. And so they were trained on how to help fight fires if they had some in the area. And so there was a time in 1953 where a forest fire was getting gone, and so they ran, the Forestry Service came there and got 30 of our men, and they went out to fight the fire. I know one of the guys, I know 2 of the guys that were actually there. And what was interesting about that is that 14 of our guys died in that fire. and 15th was one of the Forestry Service guys. I wish I had it. I don't have a copy of that yet. I'm trying to find it, but there's a letter written by the Forestry Service that talks about these guys and their testimony. He says, yes, he says, you know what's different about these guys? He says, yes, they went in and they fought and they did it, but he says they never complained afterwards. They died, these men died, but the camp didn't sit there and blame anybody. They just praised God that these guys had given their lives to serve him. And if the Lord decided to take them home early, that was okay with them. Sure, they sorrowed and they mourned, but they didn't sorrow as those who have no hope. And so they sat there and they heard all this, and they just actually had a big write-up about it, about the testimony of these new tribers out there at this camp who were just serving and being a blessing, and they were just a testimony to everybody in the community. And so people really came and gave and helped out and brought that back together again. So 14 of our guys died at that particular point. And then in 1950 and 1951, which is 3 years before that fire, we had something else happen. We had two things happen. We actually had bought some airplanes. After the war, planes were a dime a dozen. You could buy all kinds of planes, but these weren't little ones. These were big ones at that time. They were DC-3s. Used them a lot during the war, and they were planes that you could outfit to take people and go from one place. So we bought an airplane, one of those DC-3s, and refurbished it, got it fixed up, got it all up to snuff and everything. And then we had two guys who decided they were wanting to be missionaries, and they were pilots. But they weren't just any old pilots. These were accomplished pilots from World War II. They had flown over all kinds of missions. They'd flown in the Berlin airlift, which was a big thing where they were bringing food and supplies to Berlin when the communists took over. And so they were flying these in. So these were very accomplished men. And they bought this thing, and so they were taking these people on, taking them to South America. And so they loaded these people on the board, and there were 15 of them total, including the pilots. And so they loaded on, they flew to South America, and they were flying, and they were coming into Caracas, Venezuela. And when they were coming in, they were coming down through the clouds, and they were on their way to Bolivia, by the way. They were coming down through the clouds, and evidently the airport down there, for whatever reason, had shut off all their equipment. As a result, the plane didn't have a way. They were just dead reckoning. They didn't know for sure where they were at, and they clipped the top of a mountain up there, and everybody died. So there were 15 people that had died. And then the mission was pretty despondent about that. They just didn't want to do that again. I just can't even imagine the pressure they were on, outside pressure. People tell them, don't do this. You guys are just showing that you're taking chances, and we weren't taking chances. It was really a safe way to fly, but just one of those things that happened. Well, many supporters convinced them, no, you should buy another airplane and keep on doing this. And so they eventually did buy another airplane, same kind. They refurbished it, and they had actually taken several loads of people down to South America, and they came back, and on this one load, they loaded up people, and they were kind of taking a tour around the country, talking about people going down overseas, and they'd sing, and they'd give testimonies and challenge people. And the founder, Paul Fleming, was on that plane, and they had landed in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And in Jackson Hole, they had done a meeting, and then they got ready to leave, and they got in the plane, and there were, there were 21 people on that airplane. And there was one lady on that plane, and she was really interesting. She had 5 children. She was single. And she loaded those kids on board that airplane every time they did. And she said, and every time she loaded them on, she'd get to the last one, and she would tell the people standing there, she'd say, and this is the 5th reason they say I shouldn't go to the mission field. And it was interesting. They took off from Jackson Hole, and they started climbing up, because if you know that area, you have to get above the mountains first before you can fly straight and level. So they started climbing up, and the winds up in the clouds up a little higher were much stronger than they had known about. And the thing just kind of moved them over like that. And they clipped Mount Moran up there, and all of them died up there. And that they weren't even able to get to the bodies until the following spring. And so they found them up there. The plane is still up there. So if any of you ever go out to Jackson Hole and go to Mount and look at Mount Moran, it's the tallest mountain out there. And if you look at that mountain, there's 21 new tribers that are still up on that mountain buried, and the plane, the wreckage is still there. You know, the interesting thing about that lady that was loading her children on board, you know, the interesting thing about her husband was the pilot of the first airplane that crashed in Venezuela. So they were committed people, and they gave their lives, and they didn't care how the Lord took them. All their responsibility was this: we do what the Lord wants us to do just because he wants us to do it. What he does with our lives is none of our business. That's his business. And we'll just do and be faithful to him, being honest and above board on that. So that was really interesting. Then and it's an interesting thing. Just think of this. Between 1950 and 1953, you know how many people died in our organization? There was 60 people that died. 60 people. Or was that 50? I'm sorry, 50 people. 15, 21, that's 36, 46, 51. 51 people. No, actually, that's 61 people that had died in our organization from the beginning until 1953. But just from 1950 to 1953, 50 people had died. Can you imagine the pressure that they were put under in order to give up and not do what the Lord wanted them to do? But they kept on. And Paul Fleming, he was willing, and his life was taken also. And people thought that if Paul Fleming, the founder of the mission, died, the mission was going to fall apart. But you see, the mission wasn't based upon a man. It was based upon the man, Jesus Christ. And so that's the thing that we need to remember. And then in 1993, 3 people, one of them I knew personally, Mark Rich, Dave Mankins, and Rick Tenenoff. They were captured by Colombian guerrillas in Panama and taken and held back, and they just ran them through jungles and hid them off in different peoples. And we don't know exactly when, but they were killed by the what we call FARC, which is Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the terrorist group down there. And they were taken by them, and eventually they were killed, and they made them a project in that way. And then the year later, 2 of our other missionaries down in Colombia were taken. One was Steve Welsh, one was Timothy Van Dyke. Steve was our next door neighbor in Bible school. We used to laugh and have good times here. That was an amazing thing. Those were some people who went to serve the Lord, you know. A good friend of mine, one of the other reps, James Gleaves, was also supposed to have gone. What happened was these terrorists came into the school and took 2 hostages, and James Gleaves was one of them. And they put him in the truck along with Timothy Van Dyke, and James's wife had ran out of the door and given him a sandwich to eat along the way, and the men noticed that she was pregnant. And so they took him off and grabbed somebody else. And James felt quite guilty about that for a long time, he told me. But, you know, that's what the Lord does. There's reasons why he does what he does. And we're sorry to see those guys go, but we're on. If they do go, I'm glad that they did it in the Lord's service. And their families will never have to be ashamed of their parents and what they did in their lives. And then there were 2 in the Philippines back in 2001, Martin and Gracia Burnham. Martin and Gracia were friends of ours. When we went to the field, they were coming home on their first furlough, so we gave them our car, and they drove our car around for a year. And of course, Martin's family was from our church, our sending church, so we knew them from that way. But Martin and Gracia were good friends, and they were faithful witnesses, and the Lord took them through. So a lot of people in our organization have paid that price of serving the Lord, and as a result of it, through direct and indirect means, their lives were taken. A lot of that could discourage people, but what it did is it unified us. It made us want to be with each other. It made us want to go. Sorry about this, guys. This job is so important, what we're doing. Bible school is not just about gaining knowledge. It's about knowing Him. That's what it's about. Learn to understand who he is. It'll make a difference. So with that being said, I don't even know how much time I've actually used yet. Let me look here. Oh, not too bad. We've only been going for 25 minutes. I can't already talk through all of this. Listen, here's what I want you guys to know. The unity of this mission, the formation of our unity came through trials. It comes through situations that we don't necessarily like to go through. But that's okay. It's okay. Some people will say, man, I'm way behind my dad, and that's, that's hard. You know what? I am thankful for one man's debt that he had as a result of being a student in our missionary training. He didn't have enough money to continue on, so he had to come back and home and work that off. But as a result, that's how I got saved. Never look at any problem or obstacle as something that the Lord doesn't want you to do and that he won't work good out of it. He'll make you more like him the whole time. You know what? I'm going to make this lesson shorter. It doesn't need to be longer. That's the unity. That's how our unity is formed. It comes through trials and situations, but it'll make you more like him. And if you're like the Lord Jesus, how much more unified can we get? Keep pressing on, guys. Give your heart and soul to him. Thank you for all that. We'll talk to you later. And this lesson, what am I trying to say? The paper for this will be due Sunday night. And then the memory verse for whichever one you pick out, if there's more than one, that'll do on Monday morning. You guys take care. We'll talk to you later. Bye.